Hi, I'm Dr. Bob Dixon. I have been a journalist for a good portion of my professional career. I now am a professor of journalism, and journalism, not surprisingly, is what I'm going to talk about today. Specifically, what about journalism can we trust? Can we trust it at all? The answer is, well, that depends. What does it depend on? Well, stick around and I'll share that with you. If you pay attention at all to the world around you, and I know you do, then you're very aware of what I'm about to tell you. It's a problem in our culture, and you feel it probably in your right here in your gut. And that problem is that we are drowning in information. We're drowning in information from the left, from the right, from the middle, and the bottom line is we're not really sure if we can trust this information. There's so much of it, seems to be in conflict. If you've had a conversation with someone at work or maybe even a family member where maybe you don't quite agree politically about the subject, you understand that the debate tends to go nowhere. And the reason for that is not really a mystery. The reason for that is we can't agree on a set of facts. We are misinformed, uninformed. You know what I'm talking about. Why are we misinformed? Well, I'm sorry to say it has a lot to do with some failures in journalism over the past 20 years. How do we function in a society when we can't trust the facts, the supposed facts that we're hearing and reading about every day? How do we make decisions for our families? How do we make decisions for our future, for our careers, for our health? When what we read in the paper, what we hear on television or on the internet, what we read on the internet is the opposite from what we hear from the other side of the internet. Everybody's playing with their own sets of facts. So today we're going to talk about how we got here. And more importantly, how do we fix it? This isn't something that we can tolerate as a culture. We are a republic. We're a democracy. How do we function in a society when we are uninformed about how to make decisions? So before we continue, I want to tell you that failures of journalism are not new. The failure of journalism to be objective isn't new. In fact, journalism probably was never truly objective, at least not consistently objective. If you think or look back to the colonial period, before the United States was even a country, there were newspapers, and they were called by many the partisan press. Their function in society was to convince the colonials, get them to change their mind on things. Think about the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were a collection of essays published in newspapers to get the colonists to agree to ratify the Constitution. Before that, you had papers, essays in newspapers arguing, hey, should we rebel against England or should we stay a colony of England? So newspapers, even in this country historically, are not purely objective. That really wasn't even their intent. If you move forward 100 years or so, you have the advent of what has been called yellow journalism, sensationalism in journalism, journalists whipping up stories to get people who read the stories to react to them in a certain way. Does that sound familiar? President Theodore Roosevelt had a name for journalists that practiced this type of journalism. He called them muckrakers because they raked the muck off the bottom of the pool of information and drudged it up to the top just to muddy the water. That was his way of referring to journalists of his time. If you ever been to Hearst Castle in California, or watched Citizen Kane, you know about William Randolph Hearst. He was a very active political entity, I guess, and he ran newspapers, and he used those newspapers to change public opinion. So again, another example of journalism that had more to do with changing minds than just informing them. When we got to about the early 20th century, into World War I, the United States became a much more of a world player on the world stage, and it was deemed by some that the public needed more than just the information, more than just the facts. We needed to understand the facts. We needed the facts framed for us And so that really was the advent of interpretive journalism, or journalism with commentary. And it made sense at the time. But when you get interpretive journalism, someone's interpreting it. And if someone's interpreting it, then that means somebody is giving their slant on it. So again, not truly objective. And then right about the 50s and 60s of the 20th century, you have the advent or the emergence of what we call investigative journalism. You think Watergate, for example. Before Watergate, people who wanted to be journalists were people just that were purportedly just giving information. After Watergate, everybody wanted to dig up dirt on somebody, and that became the zeitgeist of the journalism model, and still is, to be honest. It's quite common for journalists to mostly be looking to find dirt, and I think you have experienced that as a consumer of journalism. And then we get into the 21st century, and you have the emergence of something altogether new. The way we receive our news today is vastly different than the way it's ever been received. When I was a kid, I won't tell you how long ago that was, but when I was a kid, we got the newspaper delivered to our door in the morning. And that's when my dad would grab the newspaper and a cup of coffee and flip through and scan the front page, the front section, maybe look at the business section. I'd grab the sports page, and we'd get, in about 10, 15 minutes, kind of what we needed to know about what happened yesterday. We were armed with that information as we went into our day. I can think of pictures of men in boxcars, or not really boxcars, but in trains, all reading the newspaper at the same time on the day that after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and it's kind of an iconic picture, and that's pretty much what it was. We all got our news fresh in the morning via the newspaper. You also then, with television, you had news television. You had the morning news on TV, and then you had the evening news. If you remember. Coming home from work at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, sit down, watch the news before dinner, and you kind of get a general sense of what happened during that day. And then, of course, you had the late news, the news at 10 or 11, where you kind of get either the national angle or the local angle, but it's kind of a wrap up on the day. Here's what happened. Basically, what you had in the old journalistic model was a 24-hour cycle. And that was kind of a cooling period. You had time, journalists had time to vet news for facts. You couldn't make mistakes that fast because the news cycle, although 24 hours seemed fast, by today's standards is very slow. But that's the way it worked. But let me ask you, how to get your news today? Well, if you're like 86% of people in this country, the United States, we get our news via social media from our phones, our tablets, our laptops. That is from a Pew Research Center survey that came out in 2020. 10 years ago, the number was half that. So it's only accelerating in this direction. And what does that mean? It means we get our news a lot faster. Sounds great, right? It is great. It's nice to get the news really fast when you know it, but the problem lies in the news cycle. The news cycle went from a 24-hour news cycle to a 60-second news cycle, a second-by-second news cycle. We are getting our news literally the minute it happens, whether that's through Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, whatever your choice happens to be. Speed has always been a competitive factor for news agencies. If you didn't want to get scooped by the newspaper across town, right? The LA Times didn't want to get scooped by the LA Herald back when there was an LA Herald. That's still true, but multiply that now by multiples of 10, because now you don't want to get scooped, but the news is going out second by second. So that doesn't leave a lot of time for vetting for accuracy. So what you see a lot of now is news rushing to get out before it's really been fully vetted, and you get mistakes, you get inaccuracies, you get information going out that is incomplete, that people who are putting it out know is incomplete, but it doesn't matter. Just get it out there. If we get it wrong, we'll call it a breaking story and we'll add more to it as we go. And that's just the model these days. But as you know, headlines kind of carry the day, and what people hear first is what they remember. So news gets untrustworthy in a world where speed is king over accuracy. And then you add to that you have the option to go really second by second. In addition to that, before, in the early model, when we got our news, there were 3 or 4 different channels to choose from. And there were 1 or 2 newspapers local to choose from. Now, we basically curate our own news. Think Twitter, for example. Who do you follow on Twitter? Do you follow people on Twitter that you don't like? Do you follow news agencies on Twitter that give you news you don't like? Probably not. You choose the news that you want to hear. And we'll get into why that's potentially a problem later on. But the thing to remember is that news nowadays, where it was a 24-hour cycle, now it's a 60-second cycle, so it's instant. News is now largely decentralized, and news, because of that, is largely unvetted, at least initially unvetted. So the result is we really can't trust the news we receive, because it's may not be that the news agencies themselves are intending to deceive, but they're running a business model and they need to be fast. So mistakes happen. We do, though, sometimes get contradictory news reports on the same issue, depending on who's reporting the news, and that's another problem that we're going to talk about. The result of all this, though, is that the onus for vetting the news, if the gatekeepers for truth that comes out to our society are falling away, the onus then falls on us as news consumers. We have to be the ones to vet our news. And that's not easy. It takes time, it takes effort. And who's got the time and the effort? Well, my counter to that question is, it's too important not to take the time and the effort. Today, we're going to talk about how to make it happen, how to vet the news for accuracy yourself. How do we do that? Well, it begins by understanding how news gets slanted in the first place. And so over the course of our time together, I'm going to talk about 12 of them. There are more, but I'm going to talk about the 12 most common forms of slanting and misinformation, fake news, whatever, however you're defining this. We'll look at my top 12, I guess, and I'm going to go in ascending order. In other words, the first one I'm going to give you will be the most obvious and easy to spot and easiest to correct, and I will work my way up to what I consider to be the most dubious and the most challenging to figure out. And number 12 is a doozy, so make sure you stick around for that one. That one's going to be a real challenge for you, but very important. So buckle up, sit tight, and we'll get into them right now.